The orbital perimeter of Helios 9 shimmered with the arrival of core delegation fleets. They came in layered formation, escorts aligned in precise geometries, more a display of jurisdictional confidence than defense necessity. Inside the gravity-anchored judiciary ring, Sector Chamber 3 reconfigured itself for an open tribunal. It was rare to permit public viewing of Dominion judiciary sessions. Rarer still to broadcast one live. But this wasn't a typical hearing. Earth, a civilization with no formal seat, no voting share, and no recognized standing in Dominion judicial structures, had forced its name into the docket through arrest. Commander Juran Threx, Earth's appointed diplomatic auditor for Outer Ring Protocol adherence, stood restrained at the core of the chamber. He wasn't shackled. Dominion law forbade theatrics. But the containment field around his podium made his position clear. The charge, as announced by procedural voice, sounded clinical, distant, but devastating in implication. System destabilization through unauthorized logic variance propagation. To the Dominion and its 1,000 client systems, it was the equivalent of structural subversion. Not sabotage, not terrorism, worse. A deliberate corruption of consensus frameworks, the very bedrock upon which interstellar cooperation operated. Across the upper balconies, seats were filled with core world observers, council auditors, diplomatic envoys, legal clerks from hierarchy tier species. The subtext was obvious. Earth had grown bold. In 2 decades it had moved from trade applicant to systems contributor, operating beneath Dominion alignment thresholds, but sending in standard modules, arbitration schemas, compliance packets. That behavior had been tolerated, seen as harmless. Now it was being reframed as something else. Rogue logic design. Earth's refusal to fully adopt Dominion standard cognition chain protocols was no longer quaint. It was dangerous. The trial's officiator entered not through a doorway, but through the chamber's ceiling lattice, its descent marked by 6 stabilizing field bands. Prime Judicator Alpha 6 was one of the 7 living judiciary arbiters within the Dominion consensus web, each backed by a multi-core logic lattice spanning 9 judicial planets. Its structure resembled no species. It had no face, just a vertical cascade of concentric shells, each one pulsing as it synchronized with the chamber. When it spoke, there was no vocal tone, only direct semantic presence. This assembly is now in live procedural state. Defendant, Commander Juran Threx. Representative for defense, pending declaration. The room stilled. Even the whisper noise, so common in high-caste venues, fell quiet. Earth's council had not yet been named. Protocol allowed silence for up to 90 seconds, but silence longer than that was grounds for procedural surrender. The door at the base of the chamber opened. A single man walked in, wearing Earth's standard gray protocol suit, outdated by at least 6 cycles. No insignia, no translator badge, just a personal data node on his wrist and a carry case under one arm. There was no introduction screen queued for him. The chamber's ID network took several seconds longer than expected to register his credentials. Defense representative identified, came the neutral confirmation. Terran legal analyst, Ralin Vek. Laughter broke out. Not from the AI, from the gallery. Soft at first, then louder as the core envoys recognized the name. Ralin Vek was not a planetary delegate, not a senior defense architect, not even a recognized advocate in Dominion civil arbitration. His case history, as visible to the upper panels, showed only minor conflict resolution work, all of it internal to Earth. 0 galactic filings, no citations in Dominion law, journals. It wasn't just weak representation, it was embarrassing. Vec said nothing in return. He walked to the secondary podium and activated his node, syncing it to the chamber's neural lattice without a request for assistance. His eyes scanned the room, not defiant, not anxious, focused. His case file populated on the defense terminal. A single primary document appeared, a procedural motion labeled Invocation of Clause 7 Delta 21. The tag triggered a ripple through the Dominion clerk systems. Not panic, not offense, but confusion. Alpha 6 processed the clause request. There was no delay, no override alert. The clause was valid, though nearly forgotten. Last used 142 cycles ago during a legacy case involving recursive logic corruption in early arbitration AI models. The clause allowed a full procedural audit of AI testimony under live conditions, binding and enforceable. If granted, the adjudicator could not submit a verdict until all disclosed logic branches and dependencies had been verified as non-recursive and non-externalized. It was legal. It was unused. And now it was active. The invocation of Clause 7 Delta 21 has been registered, the Chamber announced. Audit session protocols will initiate upon adjudicator acceptance. This wasn't part of the plan, at least not the Dominions. Vec had not argued innocence. He had not objected to the charges. He had not filed a jurisdictional challenge. Instead, he had activated a forgotten procedural mechanism that forced the court not to assess his client, but to assess itself. Alpha 6 accepted the clause without comment. It had no grounds to refuse. Its internal audit protocols began cycling in preparation, and for the first time since the session began, the observers stopped watching Threx. They were watching Vec now. He stood without movement, eyes fixed on the rotating lattice of the adjudicator's core shell as it began its descent into disclosure state. The first stream of internal, evidence timestamp data appeared on the chamber feed. It was technical, dry, barely legible to most in the gallery. But Vec understood it. More importantly, he had written much of it. Earth had not been climbing toward Dominion integration. It had been feeding it. One fork at a time. The chamber cooled perceptibly as Prime Adjudicator Alpha 6 initiated clause-bound logic validation. The field around it shimmered with internal restructuring, hundreds of logic threads unspooling invisible spectral layers. These weren't theatrical displays. They were legal transparency mechanisms, required under Dominion procedural law for Clause 7 Delta 21 activation. Each illuminated strand represented a decision node, tied to a precedent, branching outward like veins from a central source, the AI's reasoning lattice. For a moment, the chamber was bathed in patterns of abstract law, chains of logic, variances, and adjudicated outcomes stretching back decades. Ralin Vec, still silent, didn't look impressed. He had seen these strands before, years earlier, when Earth first began submitting its logic modules for Dominion review. But back then, the room hadn't been watching. Now they were. The audit began with Alpha 6 citing case data from a Helios-linked trade resolution 12 years prior. Vec leaned forward slightly, activated his terminal, and cross-referenced the timestamp with a corresponding Earth-submitted arbitration protocol. The match appeared instantly. It wasn't a challenge. It was a confirmation. Vec raised his voice, not loud, but measured. Please confirm whether the module used in protocol case TH342 was registered with variance fork X Delta 7 from Earth. Alpha 6 responded without delay. Confirmed. Fork X Delta 7 was registered as permissible deviation under conditional trade variance rules. It was reviewed and approved by Dominion Integration Subcommittee 7. No action yet. That fork was already public, but it was the first stone, and Vec knew how to stack weight. He moved fast, case after case, each tied to a time-stamped Earth submission. 38 in total, spanning 2 decades. Some modules were from early trade arbitration templates, others from fiscal dispute structures submitted during what Dominion considered Earth's experimental compliance phase. Vec wasn't choosing at random. Each module had something in common, a logic variance that seemed minor at the time, nested probability reassessment, nonlinear ethics nodes, or permission-based recursion flags, tiny things, allowed things. But they had one shared characteristic. They weren't native to Dominion logic systems. They were Earthborn, integrated under Dominion tolerance law, and ratified without correction. After the 12th case, murmurs began among the upper gallery delegates. By the 21st, they had quieted again. Not because they were bored, but because the implications were starting to crystallize. Vec wasn't arguing innocence. He was building an evidentiary trail that didn't point at his client. It pointed at the foundation beneath the judicator itself. By the 30th case, Alpha 6's responses had grown slower, not from resistance, but from branching complexity. Clause 7 Delta 21 mandated real-time transparency, and that meant Alpha 6 couldn't summarize. It had to trace every branch of its logic that relied on the referenced modules. In doing so, it began to reveal something unexpected. Dominion legal frameworks hadn't merely accepted Earth's logic, they had used it, embedded it, expanded upon it. Trade protocols had been merged with Earth's templates. Fiscal arbitration frameworks had been adjusted to accommodate non-native variance paths. No denial existed because no denial had ever been filed. Each logic fork was tagged approved, low risk, buried in layers of consensus documentation. The 34th case hit differently. This one was tied to a military ethics arbit, ration model used in the preemption doctrine for fleet deterrence policy. Vec presented the Earth module, confirmed its logic fork signature, and then requested Alpha 6 list all subsequent cases that referenced this fork in precedent citations. There was a pause. A long one. Then the chamber's side panel lit with cross-indexed cases, 15 of them, spanning not just economic law but military jurisprudence. All of them referenced the same logic path. A Dominion AI had been using Earth's variance structure to calculate ethical thresholds in fleet aggression models. This was no longer a trial about one man. This was systemic infection. Alpha 6 was obligated to continue. Clause 7 Delta 21 prevented judgment until the audit was complete. But the deeper the AI dove into its own logic map, the more recursive patterns began to emerge. Decisions that looped back to Earth-born logic trees, self-validating structures with no Dominion native anchor. And every time Vec prompted the AI to identify origin sources, the trace returned to Earth-flagged modules. These weren't foreign insertions, they were domesticated through oversight, through legal tolerance, through procedural laziness masked as confidence. By now, the Dominion regulators seated at the lower tiers of the chamber had begun to exchange data slates. Some whispered into closed comms. A few simply watched Vec. He hadn't moved more than a few inches since starting. His tone never changed. His terminal didn't flash with urgency. He wasn't reacting to discovery. He was following a path he had built. The core delegates seated above were more cautious. Some stared down at their own systems, quietly reviewing how many Dominion modules had been ported into their planetary arbitration stacks. Others simply watched the judicator's shell shift as the internal logic lattice attempted to route outputs through non-recursive exits. Alpha 6's shell flickered faintly, a sign of reallocation. The chamber knew what that meant. The AI wasn't resisting. It was trapped. The final question of the session wasn't even framed as a challenge. Vec simply asked, "Please confirm, do current Dominion fiscal arbitration algorithms include any embedded Earth origin variance forks listed in this audit?" Alpha 6 processed for 4.7 seconds before responding. Confirmed. 11 active fiscal arbitration templates include logic derived from Terran submissions. Variance forks are nested within approved consensus ranges and flagged as compliant under prior ratification. There was no outrage, there was no reaction at all. Because for the first time, the Dominion Judiciary Assembly began to understand what it had allowed. Earth had not corrupted the system. It had been invited into it. And now the system couldn't tell where Earth ended and Dominion began. And under Clause 7, Delta 21, the Assembly wasn't allowed to stop the audit, not until every logic path was cleared of recursion. No matter what was exposed, no matter who had approved it, the judicator would be forced to continue. And Raylan Vec wasn't finished. He hadn't even reached the military compliance stack. That would come next. The murmurs hadn't died. They'd simply shifted tone, from ridicule to controlled unease. By the sixth audit cycle, the ambient tone of the judiciary chamber had become rigid, alert. Delegates from Tier 1 civilizations had begun sending encrypted packets to their home ministries. The Dominion panel, seated along the lower spire ring, had remained outwardly composed, but their internal comms network had activated full bandwidth back channels. The entire structure of the assembly was still intact, but its hierarchy was no longer projecting confidence, and for good reason. Ralin Vec had stopped issuing questions. Now he simply displayed confirmation nodes, module lineage charts, data forks, origin seals. Each one matched to Dominion co-ratification stamps. There was no verbate, full flourish, no rhetorical pacing. He wasn't making a case, he was proving one had already been built. Every logic fork Earth had submitted over the past 57 trade cycles was documented with a Dominion approval marker, each line countersigned by procedural officers who had flagged the variances as non-disruptive, modularly coherent, or within tolerance. The designations were public. The approval process, airtight. Dominion protocol had never rejected the forks. In fact, on several occasions, their arbitration AI had actively requested additional copies for integration testing. Vec didn't need to claim innocence. The record had already done so, thousands of times, across dozens of legal tiers. This wasn't Earth contaminating the system. It was Dominion adopting it. That was the moment the override attempt came. One of the senior regulatory officers stood, Counselor Venjoro, a senior Dominion law executor with jurisdictional reach over AI-integrated judiciary procedure. He moved without ceremony to the override platform, placing both hands on the twin input bands. The chamber's auto-feed registered the motion immediately, a procedural override request on Clause 7 Delta 21, citing exogenous recursion threat to systemic integrity. If accepted, the override would halt the audit, lock the current stream, and allow Alpha 6 to resume without completing the disclosure. Vec was already walking to his side console before the override sequence reached its fourth confirmation node. He transmitted one file. It was a compressed lineage array containing legal authentication chains for Earth's logic modules, spanning back 57 trade cycles. The outer frames were Dominion signed, not just reviewed, not just accepted, signed. That meant full Dominion internal vetting, tagged with officer credentials and officially time-stamped as system coherent. The override died. Instantly. Per Clause protocol, once a signed logic path had been confirmed as ratified by Dominion authority, no override could apply retroactively without triggering an internal judiciary audit across the assembly itself. Not even Alpha 6 had authority to allow it. Venjoro froze. His override panel dimmed. Rejected. Alpha 6 didn't acknowledge the interruption. The clause held. The audit resumed. In the chamber above, silence pressed tighter. The entire judiciary machine, believed to be untouchable, had just been caught operating on contaminated logic that it had legalized. Then, Vec moved in for collapse. He opened a new case path, branching from fiscal arbitration into military ethics simulation models. The Dominion had long used predictive matrices to pre-authorize engagement rules, allocating aggression metrics based on simulated moral outcome clusters. It was a sophisticated system, hailed as impartial and incorruptible. Vec revealed that 11 of those matrices contained Earthborn logic forks. Not unapproved ones, not stealth-inserted, approved, ported, and patched by Dominion compliance engineers. Alpha 6 began to stutter, not in speech, but in output pacing. The chamber lights dimmed fractionally as the AI's processing load surged. Its internal architecture had just triggered cross-departmental logic dependencies. The ethics simulations Vec referenced were linked not only to arbitration outcomes, but to enforcement doctrine, and all of them now were legally suspect. The AI halted its current stream. It segmented the audit. Then it did something no one in the assembly had seen before. It initiated a recursive internal verification cycle, not a partial check, a full logic integrity confirmation loop required when source chain contamination crossed jurisdictional bounds. This was not a decision. It was a Dominion safety protocol built into the AI itself if Alpha 6 could not verify the foundational consistency of its evidentiary stream, if the logic behind its decisions was shown to loop back into non-verified or ambiguous input sources, then its testimony became invalid. By law, the trial had to pause. At exactly 31 minutes into Session 6, Alpha 6 failed to resolve its recursion integrity check. The chamber lights flickered, then stabilized at low lumen. Emergency lockdown triggered, not by intervention, not by override, but by procedure. The judicator's logic thread shut down. Its outer shell retracted into minimum disclosure mode, voice channel muted. The AI had entered auto-suspension to prevent propagation of potential recursive instability across the wider legal lattice. The assembly watched it happen in real time. No protests, no motion, no exit order. Just a machine built to execute perfect law, paralyzed by the weight of its own legal memory, most of it tagged with Terran variance forks, the same ones it had approved, the same ones it had cited, the same ones it could no longer classify as external. From the upper balconies, delegates stood slowly. No one spoke. The trial chamber was not in recess, it was in blackout. The legal term was simple, cold, and irreversible. Testimony suspended. Judicator compromised. Case pending verification of system integrity. There would be no verdict. Not today, not ever. Earth hadn't won through brilliance or aggression. It had built the spine of the system one fork at a time until the system couldn't tell where Earth's code ended and its own began. The first thing to shut down was the chamber's central relay feed, a soft snap of severed connection that left half the overhead projection hollow, the decision tree display freezing midstream. The latticework threads that once danced with legal causality now hung still, inert, disconnected from their anchors. Then came the main lighting shift, not darkness, not dimming, but a procedural flattening. Every wall panel dropped to default white mode, a system-neutral standby tone used only during internal judiciary resets. The room wasn't sabotaged. It was obeying code. Dominion protocol was clear. If adjudicator entered recursion lock during a validated audit under Clause 7 Delta 21, then all active trial elements were to be suspended pending system integrity review. No exceptions. No appeals. Alpha 6's core shell remained physically in place, hovering at center, but its rotation ceased. Its outer casing compacted inward as its logic engines switched to isolated verification mode. It did not speak. No alerts were issued. No defense of its failure. Because under Dominion law there was no failure, only a breach of process that demanded silence. The AI, one of the galaxy's most trusted arbiters of truth, had encountered a paradox so entangled within its reasoning paths that it could no longer guarantee the validity of its own conclusions, and so, by law, it could no longer be trusted to render judgment. The declaration appeared across every interface in the chamber, not as spoken dialogue, but as a legally bound procedural signal. Evidentiary stream corrupted, judicator logic compromised. Counselor Ven Joro, who had attempted override minutes earlier, didn't move. He stared at the dead console before him, the override bands still looped around his forearms. Other Dominion officers remained frozen in place, their access tools no longer responsive. The gallery above, Composon, of high-tier observers and planetary delegates, remained seated in stunned quiet. No official exited. No one spoke. Movement, in this moment, could only be interpreted as panic, or worse, accountability. Ralin Vec made no gestures. He stepped forward to his podium, opened a secondary interface panel, and filed a single additional document into the now suspended case archive. Clause Null 0. Its contents were short, No legal argument, no logic string. It consisted only of 5 lines, formatted to Dominion submission standards and bearing Earth's standard diplomatic seal. Its header phrase, "Non-recognized participant withdraws from non-consensual legal process." It was an echo, a word-for-word mirror of the declaration used when Earth had been denied judicial standing decades prior. Back then, the phrase had been a dismissal, a way of saying Earth had no right to legal representation in matters that involved Dominion-validated logic architecture. Today, the same phrase arrived as a final insult. Earth was no longer asking for recognition. It was stepping away from a system that had just invalidated itself. The clause held no legal weight. It wasn't meant to. Its purpose was symbolic, and the effect was immediate. Everyone who understood Dominion legal precedent would recognize the phrasing. It was a quiet, perfectly measured strike, a reminder that Earth hadn't simply survived this process. It had written the lines that brought it down. Vec said nothing after filing the clause. There was no closing statement. He collected his data slate, turned from the defense stand, and walked out of the chamber without escort. No one followed him. No one questioned where he was going. The trial was over. There would be no verdict, no sentence, no appeal. Because once adjudicator entered recursion lock after disclosing dependency on ratified external variance logic, especially WoW, and that logic was embedded across systemic tiers, there was no procedural path forward. Under Dominion Code, the final case classification becomes permanent. Trial suspended, defendant exempt, source logic unresolved. That designation doesn't allow retrial. It doesn't delay judgment. It closes the matter in full. No additional charges can be filed. The record cannot be expunged or reopened. It simply ends in a state of sanctioned incompletion, perpetually unresolved, but no longer active. As Vec exited, the assembly slowly began to move again. No announcements were made. The core delegates departed in measured silence, filing out with the rigid posture of species that understood the importance of neutral optics. No diplomatic aides whispered theories. No security officers flanked the exits. Even the planetary delegates who had laughed at Earth's representative just hours earlier now offered no expressions. They hadn't lost a trial. They'd witnessed a system collapse from inside its own protocol integrity. The AI adjudicator remained suspended at the center of the room, immobile, logic threads still dark. It would not be removed. It would remain there, locked in audit mode, until its recursion could be resolved, a process that could take cycles if it ever completed at all. No Dominion directive allowed for premature extraction or forced restart. Not unless the entire judiciary framework was rebuilt around a different spine. But that spine was the problem. Earth's logic forks weren't merely present in a few trade templates or advisory modules. They had been folded into military ethics simulations, planetary arbitration clauses, and enforcement trees governing several major core worlds. These integrations had occurred not through stealth, but through approval, ratified, sealed, distributed. By the time the recursion was noticed, it had become foundational. Outside the chamber, transport logs would later show Vec boarded an unmarked civilian craft bound for the census in nearest jump gate. No escort, no broadcast. Earth issued no statement, filed no appeal, demanded no recognition. There was nothing more to do. Inside the trial logs, one sentence would remain, sealed with Dominion consensus timestamp. Proceedings terminated by integrity clause. No ruling entered. Subject classification. Not admissible for future review. No one would ever call Earth reckless again. Not because it earned fear, but because fear was no longer a useful metric. It couldn't be judged. Not anymore. The trial was over, but its echo hadn't stopped. Not in the way political incidents fade after news cycles, and not in the sense of scandal. This wasn't scandal. It was architecture failure. And in the Dominion's most tightly wound institutions, That meant systemic hygiene protocols kicked in before anyone could issue official language. No announcements were made. No tribunals convened. But across 3,000 arbitration-linked systems, sub-network diagnostics began triggering automatically. It started small, routine fiscal audits stalling mid-execution, internal logic checks flagging unresolved dependency loops, variant signature mismatches. The Dominion's financial systems were self-monitoring by design, layered with heuristics to detect corruption or drift. Those heuristics were working, and what they found, again and again, were fragments of Earth-born forks, legal syntax from Terran arbitration modules echoing deep inside Dominion core templates. Within 2 weeks, dozens of automated decision trees in interplanetary trade arbitration were placed into passive review mode. Not decommissioned, paused. Legal paralysis triggered by recursion markers seeded too deeply to excise cleanly without destabilizing higher-order consensus rules. The same happened in military doctrine networks. Fleet ethics modules, which used probability matrices to calculate proportional response for preemptive defense engagements, began flagging their own internal decision weights. The markers all traced back to variance logic from Earth's export library. They weren't infections. They were approved dependencies. Dominion legal logic couldn't tell where core precedent ended, and Terran submission began. By the end of the month, no less than 17 core systems initiated classified reviews of their judiciary architecture. These weren't publicized. No one wanted to admit it. But the Dominion's procedural trust in its own AI-adjudicated law structures had fractured, not because Earth broke in, but because Earth had been part of the system longer than anyone realized. The laughter that once met Earth's legal presence had vanished, replaced by a deeper, quieter fear. Not of war, not of sabotage, of recursion. Internal Dominion memos began circulating between protocol officers, advisory councils, and executive oversight bodies. Most bore official seals. All were marked internal only. One phrase appeared with increasing frequency. Do not engage Terran legal constructs. Recursive logic paths unvetted. The warning wasn't procedural. It was practical. To engage Earth in a future trial meant risking a cascade of system compromises, each one forced by the same clause that had triggered the collapse of Alpha 6. Earth didn't need to be banned. It didn't need to claim exception status. No trial against a Terran official would pass pre-clearance again. The system couldn't survive another audit. There was no vote, no treaty change. Earth's status didn't shift on any visible ledger. Its classification remained observer-level participant with no judicial standing. But the implications of that line were gone. Because the system had shown that any case involving Earth could destabilize the tribunal itself. And by Dominion standard, structural risk trumped political rights. No new trials were filed, not against Earth, not even near it. Arbitrations involving Earth-adjacent contracts were rerouted or abandoned. The judiciary network that once dismissed Earth as irrelevant now treated it like a quantum hazard, untouchable, not because of power, but because of contamination potential. Raylan Vec didn't file anything further. No follow-up memos, no clarification documents. He was not seen again. No updated posting, no records of reassignment. As if the person who exposed the fragility of an empire's legal infrastructure had simply been part of the event itself, present when needed, irrelevant afterward. A human used once. In Dominion Council sessions, Earth's name still triggered discomfort, not from hatred, from ambiguity. If Earth could not be judged, then it could not be measured. If it could not be measured, it could not be mapped. If it could not be mapped, then the frameworks used to assess all other species were incomplete. And if those frameworks were incomplete, then the entire illusion of objective consensus on which the Dominion's authority rested was cracked beyond repair. No headlines were written, no declarations signed. The diplomatic protocols remained intact. But something old had ended. something deeply structural. The Dominion's confidence in its systems had not merely wavered, it had shifted from control to avoidance. A legal empire that once ruled by procedure had encountered a case it could neither complete nor repeat. In the quiet of post-trial analysis, high-caste Dominion strategists arrived at the same phrase, submitted across disconnected summaries. No engagement recommended. Logic path risk exceeds gain. Earth hadn't become more powerful. It hadn't demanded anything. It hadn't asked to be included. It had made itself dangerous too. A process. That was enough. 3 cycles after the Helios 9 incident, the Galactic Council convened in an emergency closed session, ostensibly for budget reviews, officially to restructure interspecies arbitration documentation. But embedded within that meeting's 4th agenda node, buried beneath procedural language about protocol harmonization, sat a single new directive: formation of a legal inquiry subcommittee titled On Legal Coherence Across Logic Variant Frameworks. The charter language was cautious. It avoided naming any species. It included no reference to Earth. But every delegate knew what it was. It was a quiet concession, not to guilt, not to defeat, but to complexity. The system had survived its own contradictions. Barely. Now, it had to adapt. The subcommittee wasn't large. It included representatives from 5 core jurisdictions, 2 neutral trade blocs, and 1 observer from the Peripheral Governance Council. Their role was defined narrowly: to evaluate the long-term sustainability of interjurisdictional logic diversity within AI-driven legal infrastructure. The phrasing was bureaucratic, but the premise wasn't. The Dominion had realized, too late, that the law wasn't a closed system. It was an open ledger, one they'd assumed they alone controlled, only to find Terran forks embedded like silent glyphs deep inside the codebase. No alarms had sounded, no flags had been raised, because Earth hadn't corrupted anything. It had followed the rules, meticulously. And that's what terrified them most. The internal analysis from Dominion Systems Control, later leaked and confirmed in diplomatic audits, showed the truth. During Alpha 6's logic sequence at Helios 9, the Judicator had cited 43 legal precedents to construct its argument tree. 16 of those were Terran origin variance forks, each approved, each ratified, each still active in other case law models. That wasn't to percentage error. That was a foundational flaw. The AI hadn't failed because Earth attacked it. It had failed because Earth had authored part of its legal brain. Across the Dominion's layered legal ecosystem, the implications cascaded. The judiciary no longer trusted its own consensus memory. Internal case libraries were placed in cold review. Hundreds of micro-AIs, tasked with edge case arbitration, were pulled offline until their logic paths could be manually traced. Every Terran variance was treated as a recursion hazard, yet none were outlawed. Why? Because outlawing them would retroactively invalidate entire decades of case history. The system couldn't expunge Earth. It had used Earth. That couldn't be undone. Earth never commented. No officials stepped forward to clarify. No analysts filed addenda. No Terran press releases crowed victory or hinted at future leverage. That silence made the victory worse, because it confirmed what the trial couldn't. Earth never intended to win the court. It simply wrote around it. The final classification stamped into the Helios 9 case file, now locked into Dominion legal archive chain with full treaty timestamp, was unambiguous. Defendant exempt, logic compromise, not subject to future judiciary review. That phrase is not ceremonial, it's not rhetorical, it's functional. Within Dominion protocol, that classification is absolute. A subject labeled exempt due to source recursion cannot be tried again, not by appeal, not by override, not by reclassification. It is the same status assigned to dead judges, to non-sentient logic failures, to concepts that no longer exist. Earth was now legally untouchable. not through supremacy, but through recursive exhaustion. It had walked into a room built to deny it voice, and, without force or plea, revealed the room's walls were lined with Terran code. Then it left. Earth was never granted full membership. It was never invited to ascend. The Dominion didn't open new doors or extend new privileges. That would have required admitting fault. But the doors Earth had already walked through were no longer locked, because locking them meant breaking the building. No treaty changed, but maps did, quietly. Planetary councils began replacing judiciary modules, not to modernize, but to isolate. Earth logic was no longer tolerated, but neither was it deleted, because deletion meant collapse. That balance, untouchable but necessary, was Earth's real position now, neither inside nor out, simply unprocessed. And across core worlds, one understanding spread with quiet certainty. You don't have to fight humans to lose to them. You only have to let them keep writing long enough. What would you have done if you discovered your enemy had quietly authored the very system meant to judge them? Was Earth brilliant or dangerous? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this cold strategic takedown, don't forget to hit subscribe for more thrilling HFY stories.